Hello everyone, today we talk about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons, especially looking at the pattern that follows with the entitlement of Bretwalda, the actual conversion of the individual kings, and the clienterly relations in the Anglo-Saxon Eptarchy. In general, I think I made only one video about specifically the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons back in the day, like 2 years ago. It has exactly this title, but albeit we reapproached in the last months a bit of British insular history, especially from an ecclesiastical point of view, we have yet not deepened the matter, and today we talk specific. It's a big topic, right? On a broader scale, what this acquires an astonishing significance is the work of civilization that happened between the Anglo-Saxons and Rome, the extension of the papal net and authority on Western Europe at large, and it's something that we will discuss more properly on another occasion. Today we don't even talk specifically of the Augustinian Gregorian mission as such, right? That maybe we'll do in another video, but specifically we'll try to look at what could the baptism, the evangelization of the people could really mean for an Anglo-Saxon king at this point. And the picture is very fascinating because there is a transformation over time that naturally goes on with the strengthening of what was known as the imperium by the Latin sources. Literally, that is this overlordship that the Anglo-Saxons thought to have, first of all, as a people themselves, even if they weren't quite a people, but rather a set of them. But let's say that they had a somewhat aggressive mindset, for which, ever since they established a solid rule in Britain, they thought of essentially of an imperial rule on all the other peoples that inhabited the British Isles, right? And this is an imperial tradition that England shares with the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain, that is often overlooked, that lived on in the Middle Ages. Like in the 10th century, the Anglo-Saxons could style a king literally as, not even as imperator, but as basileus, right? That tells you literally in the sources how much the imperial ideology was actually known by these peoples, and how Christianization naturally represented an important vehicle for a centralizing policy in lands that, as we know, especially in the case of Anglo-Saxon England, were the most fragmented, politically speaking, in Western Europe. And the Anglo-Saxons are also an exception in as much as they're the only group of peoples who basically did not accept Christianity shortly after or even before entering what had been once the Roman imperial territory, right? This is actually very important if you think about it, because the history of Germanic migration in Western Europe is, as that we've made several videos about. There is a migration era playlist, but if you go in medieval Europe one, there is as well, were fundamentally larger blocks, right? If you look at the Goths, the Franks, the Longobards, even the most fragmented cases, they recompacted themselves, especially as soon as they entered Roman territory, and or were previously Christian, right? Even if in the Arian form, maybe, which meant that basically just the elites were, and the rest of the population were pagan, but still, right? The Anglo-Saxons were coming from a basically they hadn't had quite of contact with, say, in a diplomatical sense, because they weren't properly an entity on their own, like a polity that could even be unitarily considered in this sense by the Romans, right? The Romans had been settling Saxon people in Britain peacefully, actually, since the second century AD. Eventually things had gone downhill. There was the creation, as you know, in the eastern coast of Britain, of the Litus Saxonicum to actually parry the Germanic as well as Celtic, by the way, raids, but most happened from the other side naturally, but they were mixed, right? They actually, they were globetrotters at that point, but they settled in small groups, right? And this is basically the history of Anglo-Saxon settlement. They began, as it often happens, as mercenaries in the service of the Romano-Britons, eventually took over and kept settling at different waves, right, with different areas with this initial different identities as well. But this naturally didn't favor a unitary political creation, nor the creation of a unitary church. We made a video recently looking at the archaeology of Christianity in late antique, early medieval Britain, and we have observed how fundamentally while Christianity is attested since at least the 3rd century in the most advanced areas of Britain, and in the fringe there is basically nothing. After the transformation that occurred when the Romans left, and the things that happened properly within the Romano-Britonic society, and then eventually with the Anglo-Saxon migration, we find Christian artifacts just in the West, in the Celtic fringe, let's say, whereas in Britain, in England at that point, we don't find properly much, right? And the Gregorian mission here was meant to, in fact, essentially convert a pagan reality. That, in this sense, was also more difficult to permeate uniformly, exactly because it was fragmented. And in fact, this is the case here that we see. The pattern is basically the following. There's a powerful king that accepts Christianity because he gets baptized himself. He allows the construction of churches, monasteries. There's mass conversion at some point, but at his death, very often through battle, not always, even his direct successors, maybe his sons, restore paganism. This guy had been the Bretwalda, so this overlord. That is a very complex thing to explain in actual meaning. That is what did that practically mean, right? In terms of actual power, especially, are relatively few, but for those scales of power, not so much. In fact, then eventually the center of power shifts somewhere else, right? As we'll see here, from Kent to East Anglia, eventually to Northumbria. It's always the same old story, right? Conversion matches with success, with, let's say, insular at this point recognition, also international, because we will see now Frankish influence, especially at the beginning, was strong in the process of Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons, and they called the papal mission, and then eventually the guy is killed, and and this goes on, right? As a sort of, as always, the most powerful need a church because it has a sanitary model, right? What is important is that the Christians existed in the societies, but they, and it's interesting that the papal mission was properly called into these lines. We don't know who actually did it. Of course, they were the elites in a way, but up to a certain point, there is a greater influence from the Irish mission system, whereas the Roman system is much more centralized. It's something more fitting also for post-Roman Britain, because it doesn't matter how much cities had declined there compared to the rest of Western Europe, still there was properly a urban net, or at least something that was its relic, in which an ecclesiastical administration based on the diocese, the urban diocese, it could be grafted and expanded. And therefore, this was very useful for the local elites to essentially centralize on the base of these centers. They were surely, the most advanced, realities at that point. And therefore, to especially stress a territorial character of power. That is naturally, for the sake of a state, I believe, the first thing, because if you have a power that's just floating in the air, just recognize, of course, clientelary bonds among all these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had always, like in terms of let's call it foreign policy, etc., were always crucial, like they could be for the largest powers in Europe at that point. But still, the objective was, to draw enough resources from these connections to store them in an area where it could structure power and centralize on that base and as a territorial reality. In fact, the Anglo-Saxons would take a while in order to make things start. It was a very gradual development over the centuries, but still we can see on the very long run, by the 11th century, that the Anglo-Saxon administrative system was basically one of the most advanced in Europe, right? And also had a pretty, say, a clearer idea, for example, of what a capital was than, for example, certain areas of the continent. Also, the idea of a chancery, of having a properly a palace, a broker, that's not a few, right, for Northern Europe in this time. And look at what other areas around were practically about. Think about Scandinavia, for example. So it's a path of civilization that passes through the Christianization proper, which is a big deal. It's a public thing, right? It's a big political shout-out. And it has to do naturally, but it has to contrast with paganism, but as always, this was basically an exquisitely political measure, right? Kings supported or opposed Christianization just always basically at this point from a pagan standpoint, starting point, let's say better, exclusively for the sake of power. That is to say, if you have to fight against a guy that is king and is Christian, etc., chances are you're going to support the pagan party because it's more convenient to you, independently from what you think. And already at this point, we see that was definitely a great deal of syncresis between paganism and Christianity. Think about the symbolism, I don't know, of St. Oswald's hand that is taken by the crown, and it falls, and there is a spring there. It is obvious mix of, let's say, Christian pagan symbolism in there. These guys are all also eventually, these figures are mostly sanctified. Think about Ethelbert, Oswald, as we just said, and others, because of the importance of they were the sponsors and the founders, in fact, of many important. Think about Canterbury. Think about think about Lindisfarne as well. This key, symbolical places for in British Christian history, etc. But they were de facto warriors. I mean, an Anglo-Saxon leader, chieftain, king here, they were scarcely stratified societies, and this is reflected by how fluid and unstable the broader, balance of power was in these realities. Like, literally, a guy died, and, kind of everything ended, including the process of Christianization at some point, which went back and forth. This is kind of characteristic of the Anglo-Saxons at this point, because other peoples basically either they could do that a bit between Catholicism and Arianism, but not to pagan, and say not from paganism to Christianity and vice versa, right? Back and forth. So it was at work, but these guys were fundamentally, they were always at war. And this is pretty clear. There are also, today we won't talk actually about the Irish influence, but we will talk about in other videos. But banally, Oswald of Northumbria had, been converted while he was in exile. Because he had been ousted, from his homeland in Pictland, right, where he had been converted to Christianity. So that's Northumbria would be eventually for generations later after, is that still connected to Ireland, and even later with the Vikings, for example, against the richer Anglo-Saxon, the southern Anglo-Saxon kingdom. So there is a pattern in here that is fascinating to look at, but we have to go one thing at a time. And today we really make a sketch of this, because it's simply observing these key figures that are essentially Ethelbert, Radald, and Edwin, and Oswald, but very, very simply. Then we will talk about them individually in other videos. We know that by the 90s of the 6th century, missionaries were being sought from neighboring Christian peoples by someone within the Kingdom of Kent. The Kingdom of Kent historically, also since ever, like even Caesar talks about the area back in the days, was the most developed, right, in Britain, for obvious reasons, because it was the most open to the continent, it was importantly served by waterways, etc. It was a productive center. We have archaeological evidence of, important manufacturing production scattered, these artifacts. We can find them up to the Loire river. They exported into Francia. This is the point. It was the easiest place to centralize, right? Ethelbert, as we will see now, also minted, golden coins. Was an area that was well, organized. It was not a unitary reality, though. It seems that there were kind of two halves. And this is also important historically because we actually don't even understand what these kings were actually kings of, right? Whether either one of these chunks or all together. So, or when they became king. Here we know a very few about these figures. Bede remains naturally the most important source, especially because as a Northumbrian monk of the later centuries, in a Christianized reality, he was mostly interested in describing the most important figures. Ethelbert of the Evangelization in Britain, Ethelbert being the first king in that regard, descendant seemingly from the first mercenary leaders that had been employed by the Romano-Britons. We were coming across the sea, and he talks mostly and beautifully of Oswald, Saint Oswald. Also, Ethelbert was considered a saint in that regard for the role he had, and he's also the earliest king who, let's say, to be so well documented. Because if he hadn't been a sponsor of Christianity at that point, we would know astonishingly few about this figure. The interesting aspect is that the papal mission was properly called, in a sense, because these requests for religious help in Kent seem to have basically fallen on deaf ears in the rest of Britain, but also in Francia. And therefore, the Kentish appeal reached directly Gregory the Great, that I think we don't have to introduce as a historical figure because it's so overwhelmingly important in medieval history that if you just don't even know what I'm talking about, go immediately to check. And as we were saying before, we have no idea really who actually called for this mission, but it's possible, very likely, that it was the members of the court of King Ethelbert, right? Here the chronology is uncertain, but he probably have come to the throne after 590. Now, the interesting thing about this request is that during his father's reign, Ethelbert had married a Christian Frankish princess, Bertha. And this was a big deal because at the end of the day, the Anglo-Saxons at this point, and especially the Kentish kingdom was the closest one on the channel to Francia, etc. So the most open to foreign trade, etc. So there were very strong links, but they were effectively client state of the Merovingians that at this point were a bit at the acme of their power. At least they were gradually descending already, but Merovingian power was huge, right? It was dominating, and it was actually the Anglo-Saxon interest to tie their political action to the Merovingian one, because naturally they were jealous of the Merovingians didn't invade Britain, but still it was an enormous deal to have such high level marriages with literally the daughter of a Merovingian king. And Bertha was Christian, right? And she had come over to Britain with a Christian entourage, which included a bishop, the chaplain Liudhard. So naturally, this entourage of the Queen had some impact on Ethelbert and his court. Albeit Bede the Venerable in his history doesn't quite talk about that. Albeit we have a letter of Gregory the Great, which may at least imply that Bertha could have done more to promote the faith. But the point I would say is that she had been married to Ethelbert while he was still not king, was struggling for power in a sense. It's not a clear situation, so she may not have been this immediate key figure that had gone, let's say, that had become so important as her husband still at that point, and to acquire this role of major. She was still a princess when she went there, right? Not a queen. So later on, naturally, this has an impact, but we don't know what kind of relations could there exist within the court between the political factions that were naturally there was a pro-Christian and pro-pagan one. So it's not maybe much of a problem. And in fact, we don't even know whether Ethelbert himself was converted to Christianity before any Christian mission arrived in his country, right? This is important, albeit Bede instead says otherwise, because naturally he also had to present Ethelbert in a kind of a positive, embellished light in that sense. So an already Christian king. Sure is, though, that Gregory the Great responded immediately, right, to this demand for a mission, as he really took at heart the opportunity to spread Christianity in a land where where a new church could be organized, right, and therefore extending its control, its authority in this area. And the Franks were very cooperative too at that point, telling the truth. And Gregory, famously enough, sent Augustine, together with a number of monks, to supervise the Christianization of Kent. Naturally, had already started in a way at some point. I mean, Christianity had not literally disappeared, and that's also why somebody had called from there to boost the Christianization further. And in addition, Gregory and Augustine managed, as we've seen, to get the support of Merovingian kings and clergy to expand Christianity in England for some decades. This is important because naturally the Franks had interests, as we've seen, in Britain, and however, on the longer run, Merovingian power, as you know, crumbled at the beginning of the 7th century already. There were just 4 different kingdoms. There weren't anything like during the 6th century anymore. They had actually already had important problems at this point. So one of the most important consequences would be that Anglo-Saxon England began to manage Christianization on its own, and let's say making it overlapping, as we've seen ever more, with the imperial ideal, right, and with the Bretwalda overlordship ideology, and therefore kind of constituting more kind of their own empire rather than being, let's say, supported by someone else, and albeit very gradually also in a more kind of properly unitary direction, where even though it took centuries to have what we can call England proper in that regard. And one of the reasons the Merovingians may have had for this, but also for the same marriage of Bertha with Ethelbert, is that Bertha's father at that point had actually exterminated a people that was probably akin to the Angles or the Utes, which may have had connections with the people inhabiting Kent, right? And therefore, that might have been a move to kind of reconcile power. There is actually an idea that Ethelbert was married to Bertha exactly to make him rise to power as king at that point, right, with therefore a Frankish sponsor, and that wouldn't be strange at all, right? So these connections were probably happening independently even from Christianization at that point. But from the Merovingian side, yes, sending a Christian princess was also aimed preferably at something like that too. And the rest of Britain was actually not very responsive to this. Like, eventually missionary activity, yes, spread, but intermittently, and it was mostly southeast Britain to have been invested by this phenomenon comprehensively. And albeit Augustine, during his missions, let's say better, in Britain, was in constant contact with the other Anglo-Saxon leaders, and this is important because it shows definitely an interest from their side to kind of play also politically with what was happening at that point. Now, we don't comment on the figure of Augustine, that in part he achieved important success, but also failed in other regards. He was definitely the carrying a different view of Christianity, of ecclesiastical organization. He was probably not very well acquainted to the history of the British Church, so there was surely some friction at some point. But this is, let's say, another aspect. But just for saying that, politically speaking, what was happening was very important, and it was understood by the rest of the Anglo-Saxons trying to exploit also these problems. And Christian activity, missionary activity further west was instead was greater, right? Just in around the Irish Sea, as you know, lots of interesting things were happening, and Christianization was spreading also as far as Scotland, Pictland at that point. And Augustine's mission to Kent, especially, was a success. And consequently, Ethelbert's prestige in England, as he had supervised the mission, meant that he managed to Christianize Essex and East Anglia, who accepted formally Christianity. In Essex, was the ruler was a nephew of Ethelbert. And in East Anglia, the situation was a bit more shaded, as we'll see now. This was, as we've seen, an eminently political business, right? And as the most powerful rulers like Ethelbert could put pressure on their weaker neighbors, sponsoring them in baptism and supporting missions to their kingdoms, which meant that, aside from being the godfather of these other kings, the building of a local church was controlled by him, so that in the way it was managed, arrayed, etc., there would be essentially an interference, and most specifically a territorial interference in this other kingdom's affairs, right? Because connections would remain between these foundations and the original kingdom. Naturally, much of these Anglo-Saxon kings' power, even in the case of the Bretwalda, was not dramatically, far-reaching or actually territorially incisive, but still it was a big deal for the time, as the local kings too couldn't quite control much, so even a small variation could be very impacting in the broader political balance. And let's say that in many respects, the Christianization of the English, at least as it is presented by Bede, is a classic example of Christianization from the top down. So, as it had happened a bit in Francia itself, it's properly a royal, a dynastic phenomenon. And this is also understandable considering that Anglo-Saxon society at that point in the lower classes didn't quite have many understandable reasons for accepting Christianity. So that also the broader dynastic problems were fueled by the opponents of these more powerful kings being backed by, also important parts of society that remained largely pagan throughout all the period, that were maybe, syncretic and didn't want more than else, not much another religion being imposed, and there were a few means of imposing it for real, but rather a guy, a king becoming more powerful and therefore eroding their freeman rights in a sense. So it's always the same old story actually, but it's important to stress that civilization is from the side of those who would tend to to build, to centralize something like that, also because more freedom in those societies literally meant more disorder, right? These were basically all clans who were constantly warring against each other and disrupting trade, prosperity, whatever. So a ruler, an authority, a deterrence is to be imposed, and the construction of a church locally is a way to control better, at least the allegiance of the individual clans, communities, powers, because it's fundamentally a political thermometer of how much you can impose your own control on the same. And there is also an important element in here that is the sanctity of the individual kings, in a sense that religion here was associated with a monarch specifically, and that's why, as we've just said, it had its drawbacks, because there would always be somebody who would oppose that line, and that individual specifically. For example, on Ethelbert's death, there was a temporary pagan reaction in Kent. His son, basically, that was Bertha's son, right? And that Bede says it was a pagan, but there may not be true in my opinion. But what he did is actually he married his second, his father's second wife, because his mother had died, and at this point Ethelbert seems to have married a pagan woman. In fact, he had, his son married her, and that was against canon law. So, independently from how it happened, it still meant that they were not going, the church way in that sense. But he himself, after also his mother-in-law, that eventually converted to Christianity once again. So Kent was kind of, however, more, on the track of Christianization simply for its greater wealth, openness, administration needs, and so on. There was actually a longer-lasting pagan reaction in Essex, and in East Anglia, especially, there was a pretty ambiguous situation, maybe a moment of religious syncretism under King Redwald. Redwald had been baptized through Ethelbert's sponsor. He was married to a pagan princess who, together with her courtiers, complained about this, because accepting baptism like that was not, once again, about the religion itself, but it was recognizing Kentish power on East Anglia at that point. So Redwald went on, with both things. He had both a church and a pagan shrine, and coexisting in the same period. There's another important figure, and Redwald, importantly enough, became Bretwalda as well. It was considered as such after Ethelbert's death, so he became the most powerful ruler in here. He also helped Edwin of Deira in southern Northumbria to rise to power. Edwin was a protege of Redwald. There were, even in there, quite some risks, because Edwin's Northumbrian rival actually tried to have him killed when he was at Redwald's court, and Redwald, thought about it a bit. Actually, allegedly, his wife said it would have been against pagan morals to kill Edwin while he was a host in their court. So you see here also different morals intertwining in a theoretical red world had to be kind of more Christian-like instead. So just to say that Christian and paganism also inhere that do not, do not have a watershed between them for which one is radical in one sense or in the other. We're mostly sharing certain common values of the same society. Edwin would rise himself to the Northumbrian kingdom, that at this point is scarcely a unitary thing. It's mostly Bernicia and Deira, kind of, mostly. Not even in Oswald times it would be a unitary thing, nor it actually had a true unitary identity in that sense. But importantly enough, Edwin, again, in all this, was converted to Christianity, and he became, at that point, as a powerful ruler, Bretwalda himself. Right, all these guys eventually died, killed in a battle, right? And at their death, paganism was restored. This is the pattern we were saying before, right? Edwin, importantly enough, had promoted Christianity in the north of England after his marriage to a Christian daughter of Ethelbert. Mm-hmm. Probably she was the daughter of Bertha. And we don't even know these things because sometimes we don't, they're not explicitated who was daughter, son of whom, Again, however, the fate of Christianity was linked to that of the king. It was a dynastic choice, we could say, at that point. Edwin was killed in battle in 633, and even in here we have the pagan reaction, which was only reversed with the establishment of a new Christian king, Oswald, that had been converted, as we were saying before, by the Irish while in exile in the further north. And Oswald also was Bretwalda, right? It had a hell of a power over important areas, even seemingly in the same. Bede the Venerable says that he enjoyed a power all over England, let's say. It's not quite true. We know that especially when he rose to power, the southern Anglo-Saxons kind of opposed him importantly. But probably he did enjoy an important power even over pagan Mercia. So this speaks for effective power by Anglo-Saxon standards of the time, and this all goes in parallel with Christianization. So, as always, how does it happen historically? The church is introduced, is built, is established in the most powerful areas, where the most powerful elites are, because they have to manage more, they have to control more, and it's largely spontaneous as well. That is, these guys basically convert themselves to Christianity. They convert a lot of people together with them that are not forced, but they are simply, from their side, in a sense, and the coexistence between Christianity and paganism goes on for centuries and centuries without much problem. And still, this gives more security, more stability on the long, in spite of, this astonishing reality. Anglo-Saxon kings always kind of fighting all the time. So you were one of the most radically violent and tumultuous realities in Europe at this point. But still, it's true war as well that this necessity is realized, because when your power is insecure, you have also to fight, you have to find resources for that. You do need this internal cohesion, and this passes as well also through what kind of, side you are relatively to religious policy. And in all this, as we were saying in the beginning, aside from the Romans and the Franks, the Christianization of the English passed importantly also through the Irish, and that would so much that it would, from insular Christianity, as would go as far as basically re-Christianizing important areas of the continent. But this is something that we will talk about on another occasion. So it's really a sketch. It's really just this, but to observe certain aspects of this phenomenon that I think to be very important, especially the coincidence between the monarchy, Christianization with the monarchy, and more with the Bretwalda title, right? And in general, the greatest power that in England as it was, through this status, right? So this has deep consequences also for, I would say, the history of the English monarchy at large. I mean, the idea also of sainthood, as you know. I mean, think about Edward the Confessor, or I mean, the idea that the English monarchy historically in its development owes much to this important idea of dynastic authority based also on religious power, more than probably any other country in Europe. That is to say, if you look also at the ideology of the crown and of the idea of a kingly figure that goes beyond, let's say, the individual that embodies the same figure, that is mortal, and after another will come. Actually, it's England in the low Middle Ages as well. I mean, it's a very far-fetched conclusion here to draw it back to early Anglo-Saxon times, but let's say it still has much more of a an ideological and properly well-structured political conception than even the, let's say, the kingdom of the monarchy par excellence, that is France, that in fact imports in part also certain English models. And this is not to be overlooked, because even in there, London is an earlier and more of a capital than Paris historically, and this dates back to these times, to this effort of centralization. And this maybe sounds strange to maybe a common law hearer, a listener today, but okay, now we open too much of a parenthesis here, but never underestimate in this regard that even the idea of a dialogue, and a defined one very well, between the monarchy and the stands, the other social representatives in the Kingdom of England is naturally a contingency. Had the English won at Bouvines, history would have been very different, right? But it still has this important, monarchic gestation, let's say, in the previous centuries, that it is very, very important to stress. Anyhow, for now, really, we'll stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.